have not. So I'd like to just give you a brief intro about Delaware Interfaith Power and Light, our mission, and a little bit about this program. So Delaware Interfaith Power and Light, we are a faith-based environmental nonprofit. We have been around for over a decade, working on the biggest crisis humans are facing today, that is climate crisis. And we work on climate change and climate solutions. And we really believe it's a moral obligation to act on it, and to act on it now because it is urgent. And Climate Conversation is one of our educational programs because, you know, with everything else that we do with our programs and climate policy, education is a big piece of it, educating the community on who's getting impacted. So before I get into that, I do want to say that Climate Conversation program is funded by Energize Delaware. They are the funder of this program. Energize Delaware is a state-funded nonprofit, and their mission is to support businesses, residences, and nonprofits to become energy efficient and climate resilient. So if you have not checked their website, please check it out at energizedelaware.org. They have wonderful programs and low-cost loans that can help everyone. Climate Conversation program started several years ago, and this is our, I think, 45th or 46th Climate Conversation program. And we have dealt with many different topics. Today's topic is birds and climate change. I personally started my journey into climate activism because I am a nature lover, and that really drove me to it. I feel like at this point, as a nature lover, you can't sit at the sidelines and just appreciate the outdoors or love the birds that you so love, when you know that their population is really declining, dangerously declining. I was a nature educator before. I worked with Delaware Nature Society before. And you know, when you teach the young kids or adults about the declining population of monarchs or the precious birds that you love, or the insects or the biodiversity loss. So in this program, what we'll capture is we have our bird experts who will tell us what's happening to the bird population. And then we also have our special guest, Dustin Thompson from Sierra Club, who will be talking about a climate legislation that we are proposing, which can get us to net zero by 2050. And without any further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Ian Stewart. Dr. Ian spent a happy childhood exploring the woods and seashore of his native Northeast England, where he developed a lifelong interest in nature and especially birds. He completed a PhD on the breeding biology of birds at the University of Leicester, UK, followed by research positions at the universities of Kentucky and Delaware. He currently works as an ornithologist at the Delaware Nature Society, where he conducts research into how the society's land management practices are affecting biodiversity, with a particular focus on birds, and also leads bird walks and nature outreach programs, including public bird banding sessions. He's now a naturalized US citizen and lives with his wife and 2 young sons in Kennett Square. By the way, I have taken my children to some of his bird walks and bird banding session, and my children love and recognize him. So off to you, Dr. Ian. You are muted.
Do you see my screen?
Right.
Yes, we do.
Okay, birds and climate change. Right, okay, hopefully this will go forward. Okay, so here's a bunch of birds, obviously, and birds are a great introduction to this topic. And it's important to realize that birds obviously aren't the only thing impacted by climate change. All range of animals and plants are, but birds are a very great focus because they're very familiar to lots of people. So even if you not really know that much about birds, you probably recognize the birds shown here. So the great thing about birds is they're very visible, they're here year round, they're mostly active during the daytime, they're very noisy. So a lot of people are interested in birds. And just my starting segue is if you've heard the phrase, the canary in the coal mine, because that's what birds became for the showing effects of climate change on natural populations. So if you've never heard this phrase, so when people used to do a lot of underground coal mining, underground coal mines tended to have carbon monoxide gas, which is very dangerous. People die from inhaling it. But the problem is it's colorless and odorless. So coal miners didn't know it was there and they would die without realizing it. So they started taking canaries down into the coal mines with him. So the guy on the left is holding a canary in a cage because birds are very sensitive to carbon monoxide. And so if the bird started fluttering, people would realize there was carbon monoxide and it was time to get out of there. But I like this analogy because birds have become the canary in the coal mine, showing us that climate change is having effects on wild populations of animals. And the very first big evidence of this came in 1997, which is actually 25 years ago. This was a study published in the journal Nature, which is one of the world's most prestigious journals. And so a lot of people in Britain had been going out looking at bird nests in their yard or in the woods and sending in the data to the British Trust for Ornithology. And scientists there looked at these nest records from 65 species of birds from 1971 and 1995, and they found that 31% of them were now breeding earlier. And if you look at this graph, on the side axis going up the side, January the 1st is day 1, January the 1st is day 2, etc. So a high number means late in the year. And so you can see from this graph that in just a 25-year period, birds are breeding earlier in Britain. And then not long after that, there was a big study came out from North America. So there was a lot of birds like tree swallows and bluebirds, which normally nest in cavities like this, old woodpecker holes. And people were interested in saving these birds. So they started putting out these wooden nest boxes, which you see all over the parks and towns around here. And these get colonized by bluebirds and tree swallows and wrens. And it turns out that these nest boxes provided a real treasure trove of data because people had been checking the counting how many eggs were in these boxes, when they were laid, all this sort of thing for years and years. And so some scientists were able to show, look at the data, historical data of tree swallows, and they compared their laying dates in 1959 with 1991, and remarkably, tree swallows were laying 9 days earlier. Okay, in the space of just 30 years, they've changed their laying dates by 9 days earlier. And just remember, in evolutionary time, 30 years is almost nothing. So this was a dramatic demonstration. And I should say, if you want to get involved in this sort of thing, there is a scheme through Cornell University, NestWatch, where anybody can just get a free account and start counting eggs of bluebirds or whatever in their yard, or in fact, any sort of bird. This is me checking robins on my porch, because it's important that we have data from lots of different types of birds to see which ones are being more affected by climate change than others. Anyway, and then the original authors of the British paper did another analysis where they went and looked at 31 British species with over 50 years of data. And again, over half of these species showed changes over time in relation to temperature. So pretty much the same graph. You can see if the spring is warm, okay, the birds start laying earlier. And because springs are getting warmer, the birds are starting to lay earlier each year. An interesting, another way of looking at this was there was some people did a study involving mist nets. So these mist nets are things where you put up these thin nylon nets in the woods, and what happens is the birds can't see them, so they fly into them, and then you just carefully take them out and measure them. And the reason you're doing this for breeding birds is you're trying to see how many birds are young birds. Okay, you're trying to figure out when the young birds are first appearing every year. Okay, when the babies have left the nest and you're catching them in the nets. And the reason you need mist nets to do this is that young birds are very hard to see. They tend to be very shy. They blend in well. They just sort of sit there and wait for the parents to feed them. So doing this helps you track when juvenile birds first start appearing. So for instance, this is a field sparrow, which is a fairly common bird around here. The adult bird is the one at the bottom right, but you can see the one in the main picture. You can tell it's a juvenile because it's got a soft beak and very fluffy feathers. So there was a really interesting study done in Pennsylvania in 2016. So they had been doing this mist netting every week in the summertime for 53 years, a pretty amazing data set. And they were also looking at temperature data, and they found that the temperature and rainfall were both increasing during this 53-year period, especially in the early spring, which is when birds are feed. And they found that 13 of these common species around there were hatching their young earlier. Okay, so in other words, as the years went by, they were finding the juvenile birds in the nets earlier every time. And you're probably wondering why I'm spending so much time talking about, you know, laying dates and hatching dates and when the juveniles appear. Okay, why is that important? And the reason it's important is because a lot of birds only really have one breeding attempt every year. Okay, maybe two, but they don't have very many. And what they usually feed their young on is soft, squishy things. Okay, like insects, caterpillars, all this sort of thing. Small worms. And the way it's usually worked over many years of evolution is that the birds try to time their laying so that when the nestlings emerge, okay, when the nestlings hatch out, it coincides with the peak food availability, okay? Because you want your nestlings to hatch when the most insects are around. So if you look at this graph, this is what traditionally would happen. This is a date along the bottom, and here's a little curve. So most birds are hatching their eggs in May, which is the same time as when the insects are emerging. Okay, so there's plenty of food for their young. The problem we've now got is because the temperature is rising and springs are warmer, the birds are breeding earlier. So the range of hatching date shifts to the left. So birds are hatching out earlier, but the insect abundance, okay, hasn't really changed that much. So now birds are hatching earlier, but there isn't as much food to feed their nestlings because the insects haven't really emerged yet. Another great thing about birds that we've been able to pull data from is the Christmas bird count. So the Christmas bird count is the oldest citizen science project in the world. It's run by National Audubon Society, started in 1900. And people used to have this sport where they would go out at Christmas time and shoot birds. And then this guy, Frank Chapman, had the idea of, instead of shooting them, why don't we just go out and count them, you see? And so now, round about Christmas, bunches of people go out all over the country and they just count what they see. And I do these in Delaware, and it's a really cool day out. So this is me. It's sunrise. There's the Delaware Memorial Bridge in the background. You can see the frost on the ground in front of me. Some days you're out all day counting birds and you end up at the sunset down Little Creek, down the coast. So it's a fun day out. You're counting all these birds at Christmas. But because people are doing this all over the country at roughly the same time of year, we're getting some really great data on where the birds are. And what we're finding with that data is over half of the bird species are now wintering further north. Okay, so birds are expanding their wintering range. And then a paper just came out this year finding that 32 of our common bird species are also expanding their breeding range north. If anybody's interested, the American Birding Association does a podcast, where they interview the author of these papers, and this was the most recent one, and you can download it from their website. And so it's pretty amazing to think that birds, like at the bottom here, I've got a cardinal and a mockingbird. These didn't used to be found in New England and Canada, but now they've spread all the way up north. And so they're there in the breeding season. So they're expanding their breeding range, their wintering range. And we think it's because the winters are now warmer. So these birds can now tolerate those northern winters. And of course, the downside about that is it means all your new colonizing birds are now increasing the competition for food with the resident birds. Okay, and here's another big aspect of climate change, which is very relevant to Delaware, which is sea level rise. This is a pretty stunning graph. It comes on, in fact, just to show you how much people study climate change on birds. There's a book called Effects of Climate Change on Birds, which is now in its second edition. So there's lots of people studying the effects of climate change on birds. And as you can see, the sea level is steadily rising from year to year. And although it's just a couple of millimeters each year, that may not sound very much, but the cumulative effect of that over many years is pretty dramatic. And it's very relevant to Delaware because we're a low-lying coastal state. And as regards bird watching, we're actually famous for our coastal marshes. If anybody's been along to Bombay Hook and all these places, we've got all these famous coastal marshes where you get specialty birds nesting like rails. But the problem is, because the marshes are so low lying, if the sea level rises, the birds are going to lose nesting sites. Okay, either the nests themselves get flooded or the nesting sites change, because as the salt water starts creeping into the marshes, okay, and salinity, the salt level increases in the marshes, the types of plants which live in the marsh change. Okay, some of the marsh plants can't tolerate the salty water, so they die off, which reduces nesting sites for birds. But also, if the marshes get very salty because of sea level rise, the type of prey, like the insects and invertebrates that these birds feed on, start disappearing. So there's multiple negative effects of sea level rise. And just a sort of classic bird example of this is the black rail. So this is a rare bird now in the whole country. Fish and Wildlife, it's on the endangered species list. I've never seen one. They're only active at night. They're really small. They're all black. People call them the feathered mouse because they're just the size of a mouse. They're only 6 inches long. And these used to breed in Delaware, but they were in the coastal marshes. And we now think they're almost lost as a Delaware breeding bird because of sea level rise has changed the composition of the marshes. And so these birds can't breed in Delaware anymore, unfortunately. And you may have seen this website, that was a big report a couple of years ago showing 3 billion birds have been lost in the last 50 years for lots of reasons, mostly habitat loss, but also the habitats themselves have been compromised and degraded. And again, just showing this slide, insects are hugely important for birds. Birds need insects to feed their young, but they also feed on insects themselves. Lots of warblers and vireos and flycatchers depend on insects for their food, for migration as well. And the problem is we're losing insects rapidly. And it's because, well, one of the reasons is we're flooded with alien non-native plants. Okay, all these things like Japanese hops, Milominnaweed, porcelainberry, and multiflora rose, they're covering our landscapes, and the big box stores sell all these foreign plants. And the problem is our native caterpillars can't subsist on these alien plants because they haven't evolved with them. And so lots of research from Doug Tallamy's lab at the University of Delaware has highlighted the importance of native plants. And the question is, of course, how is climate change going to affect these alien plants relative to our native plants? And there was a really big study came out in this journal, Global Change Biology, showing where they took 200 species and they looked to see which ones are going to do better, which do better at higher temperatures and higher carbon dioxide concentrations. And of course, what they found was these non-native invasive plants outperform the native plants in several of these key metrics. Okay, so if carbon dioxide levels in the air keep rising and temperature keeps rising, the invasive plants are going to do better, and they're going to spread at the expense of the native plants, which means fewer insects, which means fewer birds and mammals that eat those insects. And Audubon is doing some really great work on this. And if you look at their website, they've done a really good job. And I can drop all these links in the chat, by the way. They have this really great thing on their website where you just enter your zip code or you say which state you're in, and they do this visualizer where it shows you, so this is for Newcastle County, Delaware, it shows you which species are vulnerable to climate change under different scenarios, different projections of how much the temperature is going to rise. And so for Newcastle County, if the temperature rises 3 degrees by the end of the century, there's 12 species which are highly vulnerable, okay, and may go extinct in Delaware. And I'm showing this because these are all very different types of birds, okay, sparrows, thrashers, tanagers, warblers, because there's multiple effects of climate change on these different types of birds. If you get spring heat waves and summer droughts, that's really bad for sort of birds that are out in the open, like grassland birds. And of course, very relevant to this is last weekend. Last weekend was still May, and it was 94 degrees in Delaware. It was crazy. Also, heavy rains are very bad for birds that nest out in the open, especially. So if you remember, in early May, the first weekend in May, we had basically 3 days of solid rain. Okay, so that's very bad for birds because it drowns the eggs or nestlings. And also, a lot of violent storms are very bad for our coastal birds. There's a lot of birds in southern Delaware nest on the beaches, okay, like terns and plovers, a lot of rare birds. And that's why if you go down to Cape Henlope and then beaches are fenced off for public access. But the problem is if you get violent storms, it erodes all those habitats, and so it removes the nest sites. And I always mention this point about the storms because I think when you talk about climate change, a lot of people kind of think that you're just talking about temperature rise, but it's not just that. It's not just temperature rise, it's sort of wild oscillations in the temperatures, okay? So as time goes by, we're going to get bigger swings between extreme heat and extreme cold, and extreme heat gets associated with turbulence in the air. So a bigger, another effect of climate change is more hurricanes, more downpours and all this thing, which all have terrible effects on birds. And just finishing up here, so the Delaware Nature Society does a lot of advocacy work. The kind of priorities we go for is trying to get people to transition to renewable energy sources, okay, to move away from fossil fuels. So try and get breaks for companies to get renewable energy, increase things like solar panels on businesses and housing. We try to advocate to protect natural systems that mitigate the effects of climate change, like promoting the use of native plants, which are more resilient to environmental disturbances. And then also, you probably know Delaware has a climate action plan. So we're trying to pressure, the governor to implement these plans, including some really aggressive carbon emission reduction goals. And just today, and so you've probably also heard of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, RAWA, through the National Wildlife Federation. This is a really important act. It's actually one of the few that's got bipartisan support. And what it provides is a huge amount of money, okay, over $1 billion annually for state wildlife action plans. So what's happening is every state, obviously including Delaware, has came up with a wildlife action plan where they have figured out what the species of greatest conservation concern or need are. And so if this act gets funded, that will deliver a lot of money to try and protect those certain species in these disturbed habitats, like our marshes or our or our woodlands. And in fact, they just released this alert today, where it's like an action item where you can go on and sign this on. So your members of Congress will hopefully act, because you can do things at the individual level to try to deal with climate change, like have a wildlife-friendly yard and plant natives and reduce your own carbon footprint. But for real sort of broad-scale effects, you have to be at the higher legislative levels. So we need the lawmakers to act to funnel more money towards the people who know how to go about saving all these different types of birds and other animals. And just to end up with my last slide, this is a quote, an old philosophy quote that I think is quite appropriate, which is, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you're heading. In other words, if we don't do anything, we're in for a desperate crisis. It's going to get warmer and warmer. The sea levels are going to rise. We're going to lose more and more habitat for not just birds, for lots of other animals. And so that's all I was going to say, really. So thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Ian. That was an excellent presentation. You covered everything from, the why and what people can do, starting from individual actions to policy change. So thank you so much for that great presentation.
Right, so stop my share.
All right, now I would like to invite our other bird expert, Steve Cottrell. He's the current president of Delaware Audubon Society, active in supporting nesting birds and restoring public open space in northern Delaware. We recently had a prior conversation on offshore wind, and we had somebody from the National Audubon join us and talk about some of the great advocacy work that they are doing. So I'm really looking forward to your presentation, Steve. Take it away. Oh, Steve, I think you're muted. The screen was fine. It was just we couldn't hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, hear you now.
All right. Thank you. Yes, I'm Steve Cottrell, the current president of Delaware Audubon. I've been a board member of Delaware Audubon for about 4 years. I've been an avid bird enthusiast for only a slightly longer period of time, but I've been a plant enthusiast all my life. And the reason I connected with birds is because I attended a presentation by somebody from Pennsylvania Audubon speaking about birds and plants, advocating native plants to support birds. And then it made sense, if someone's going to spend time working with plants, why not do it with a purpose? So I started learning about the plants that benefit birds, and I got to learn about birds that way. And now I'm spend my whole year protecting habitat for birds. I'm going to dovetail off of what Ian spoke about. There was a study conducted by National Audubon in 2020. They called it Survival by Degrees. That's the name of the website. Ian presented some slides from that. But as you can see, the main points from the study was 2/3 of North American birds are at an increasing risk of extinction from global temperature rise. And they determined that 389 species are on the brink, very close to disappearing completely. As the climate changes, so will the places birds need. As Ian pointed out, birds are nesting further north because it's just too hot where they traditionally nested. Their young are having trouble surviving in greater heat. They're forced to find more favorable habitat further north. But as Ian said, there's increased competition for prey and food, and they may not survive. And birds, there's a limit to how far north you can go. The birds that are already nesting further north have nowhere else to go because they just run out of space. This is also from that Survival by Degrees website. Ian listed Newcastle County. I'm showing birds, vulnerable birds in Delaware. There's 3 scenarios in the study: current conditions, and then 1.5 degree increase, 2 degree, and 3 degrees. At 3 degrees, 13 birds are at high risk. And I'm going to highlight eastern towhee. This is current conditions for eastern towhee. This colored yellow means that the population is stable. So in Delaware, it's there's no problem with eastern towhee. It's a fairly common bird throughout the state, and it's here in Delaware in the winter. But under a 3 degree temperature rise, the Audubon study determines that there will be no towhees in Delaware. Red means that they've completely lost that habitat. Now the yellow, which was 100% of eastern US currently, that's going to be reduced to 17% of the area. And they're going to increase their range 23% up in Canada. So this is just 3 degrees. And that's just one bird. And there's hundreds, they determined there's almost 400 other birds that are facing the same predicament. The climate threats facing the eastern towhee, where there's fire. We don't have the problems they have out west with wildfires, but spring heat waves are a big issue. They endanger young birds in the nest. Heavy rains, climate change leads to more unpredictable weather, greater frequency of extreme weather events. You have heavier storms, more frequent storms. So that'll impact nesting birds in the spring. And urbanization, that has nothing to do with climate change. That was habitat loss from colonial period on. There's another bird that is in the news recently, the last few years. It's now listed as threatened by the United States Fish and Wildlife. That's threatened under the Endangered Species Act of 1973. That means it's threatened means it's at risk of becoming endangered. The next level is endangered, which means at risk of becoming extinct. The red knot, I don't want to go into the full story of it. It's a very fascinating story of this bird. It has one of the longest migrations in the animal kingdom. It spends its winter at the southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, just above Antarctica. And then it flies north to breed, and it breeds inside the Arctic Circle. in the high Arctic. And it makes this migration with only 2 stops. And one of them is in Delaware, the Delaware Bay. It's Delaware and New Jersey. And it comes here in the spring, and it times its arrival in the Delaware Bay to coincide with the arrival of the horseshoe crabs, which are laying eggs on the beach. So it stops in Delaware Bay to feast on the eggs, and within 2 weeks, it almost doubles its body weight. So it's a refueling stop. And then from the Delaware Bay, it flies nonstop to the Arctic. And this bird has a lot of threats. One of them is climate change now. The other threat is that the population of horseshoe crabs is decreasing because it's harvested by fishermen to use as bait for eel and conch, which aren't even consumed in the United States. It's for an export market. So the horseshoe crab population crashed in the 1990s because there were no regulations. And then at the same time, the red knot population plummeted. And neither has recovered from that period. They are restricting the harvest of the crabs, but they're still harvesting them, and the red knot population continues to decline. The climate change impact, it causes these extreme weather events in the spring, and if it occurs, a storm occurs during their stopover in the Delaware Bay, that's a disaster. And it also, the climate change affects the water temperature, the Gulf Stream temperature. And a couple of years in the last decade, it was much colder in May than normal. And when the horseshoe crabs delay their arrival, and if their arrival on the beach doesn't coincide with the arrival of the red knots will not survive their migration. And that's what happened. The year that the ocean temperature was cold in May, the following year, the red knot numbers dropped dramatically because they failed to reach the Arctic. And if they reached it, they didn't have enough reserves on board to survive, because sometimes they get there early before the snow melts. And if they don't have sufficient energy reserves until the insects are available, they won't make it. And the other thing is climate change makes the spring weather in the Arctic more unpredictable. So you can have the same kind of disaster scenario on the breeding grounds.
Hey, Steve, just want to remind you, you have 3 minutes.
Okay. One thing about climate change, what can people do? Dustin's going to be talking about policy. One thing individuals can do is to reduce your lawn. Your lawn has no benefit. It contributes to climate change because of the high maintenance. There's high carbon costs with maintenance. Here's two pictures. These are properties side by side. The one on the right is mine. The one on the left is my neighbor's. Which one is helping the climate condition? Which one isn't? Okay, so if you reduce your lawn, plant trees. What trees to plant? This is a study by Doug Tallamy. Ian mentioned it. We need to if you're going to plant a tree, plant something that benefits wildlife. And this is Dr. Talamy's study here showing that oaks and cherry and willows are the top species for providing benefits to wildlife. Okay, if you have any questions about plants or birds, DelawareAudubon@gmail.com. We'll answer your questions. Thank you.
Oops. Sorry. Oops. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you so much for that excellent information. And Steve's information is here, but I will also, at the end of the presentation, in the next couple of days, will send the recording and the slide decks and the contact info if the presenters want to share for any further questions you might have. So now we have covered that, if we remain on the same path, it is really a dangerous path. And, birds are hurting, human population, as we say, is threatened. And so what can we do about it, right? So we can definitely take those personal actions in our backyards and plant more natives and, put our bird feeders out and enjoy those lovely birds every day. But we know we need to do more. And so the best way we can really make the biggest difference is moving policy. And now I would like to invite our last guest, Dustin Thompson. Dustin is the advocacy and outreach organizer for the Sierra Club Delaware chapter. And he spends a lot of his time at the club working on energy and climate policy on the state level. Last year, he played a role in passing legislation to increase our renewable energy portfolio standards and create a community solar program in Delaware. Now he's focused on reducing Delaware's greenhouse gas emissions to do our part to tackle the climate emergency. And before Dustin starts, I just want to say I've worked really closely with him, and he's been a climate champion for us, and we work together. And we're working together on current policy, and can't wait for his presentation. Dustin, take it away.
Hey, hey everybody, thanks. Share my screen here. So in an effort to save some time for folks to ask questions, I'm gonna go through this a little bit faster than I would, and happy to answer questions at the end. So I want to talk about what a climate emergency is and is not. I'm going to go over what greenhouse gas emission reduction goals are, what a climate directive is, and why we need these actions to be followed up with a lot of planning and reporting to tackle the climate crisis. So I always like to start out the conversation around declaring a climate emergency by talking about what a climate emergency is not. So it is not a what we've been going through for the past couple of years in regards to COVID, which was a public health emergency, nor is it a state of emergency like we generally see in major storms, natural disasters, that type of thing. Both of these things allow additional police or extraordinary powers to folks like the governor, who would not normally have those kinds of powers. But it is a recognition of the situation that we're in and a commitment to action by the state or jurisdiction. Now, I will preface that by saying, or not preface, but I'll add on to that by saying on the national level, if like a national government declares a climate emergency, then there are powers given, but if a state or local jurisdiction does, then there's not. So what exactly are greenhouse gas reduction goals, and what types of pollutants are we talking about specifically? So we're not talking about one thing you may have heard recently, more and more being discussed in Newcastle County, is ethylene oxide. That's not, it's a good example of what is not considered a greenhouse gas. It's still a pollutant, and you still could possibly get some reduction in co-pollutants like that when you reduce greenhouse gases. But what we're really talking about is methane, carbon, fluorinated gases, and nitrous oxides. So generally, to reduce these types of pollutants, these greenhouse gases, it's usually the goals that are set are usually met by a variety of policies and administrative actions. So it could be increasing a state's RPS or clean energy standard through legislation, or it could be joining the zero emission vehicle mandate, which Delaware's now done both of these things, and that's an administrative action. So 24 states have greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. Some are legislative, others are executive. So Delaware is one of those 24 states, but ours is executive. And so the next governor could come in and say, no, we're not going to do that. Let the greenhouse gases roll. Usually the goals are set in stages of 5 to 10 year intervals. And normally in most states, there's a long-term goal, and more we're seeing that long-term goal being switched, if it was not already, to net zero by 2050. So Delaware has, as Ian mentioned, done a climate action plan. Part of that climate action plan was a lot of modeling. So they looked at what would happen if we took 20 actions in Delaware. And most climate action plans focus in on a set number of actions. Generally, they are actions that are already being done or in process of being done. So how do we like increase a program or reach a new population with an existing program, things like that. You can read what 20 actions that were identified in our climate action plan at the link that I believe Ian provided earlier in the chat. But the end result was they said we could decrease our emissions by 31% by 2025. We're on track right now for 26% by 2025 and 41% by 2035. We know that that's not enough. The science is pretty clear that really need to get to 50% by 2030 with that long-term goal of net zero no later than 2050. So we have been, let's say, agitating for those goals. So we said 50% by 2030 with some interim goals and net zero by 2050. But we wanted a backstop because net zero really is, it can be a misleading statement. So ideally, you actually set a goal for 2050 and not just leave it blank at net zero. We call that a backstop. Essentially, we don't want to get to, let's say, 90% by 2045 or 2050, and then say, well, we reached 90%, but we now have some magical carbon capture technology that is yet to exist effectively. And now we're going to start polluting greenhouse gases again because, oh, we can capture them. We don't want to do that because, as I mentioned, then you increase those co-pollutants as well. And certainly there are no guarantees that any type of capture technology would be permanent or to the same effect that just straight reducing emissions. Forgive me for going so quickly. So a climate directive is something new to most folks. So I want to talk about that for a second. Essentially, what the problem we have in Delaware is we have a number of state agencies that are either not considering climate change and greenhouse gases, or they are prohibited from doing so. So a good example of that is the Public Service Commission and the Public Advocate. They are by legislative statute required to consider certain things. Greenhouse gases and climate change are not on that list. And so they interpret that as they are not allowed to consider said things. So the solution is pretty simple. We tell them that they have to. If we establish goals, it doesn't really do us any good if none of the state agencies are working to achieve them. So we really need all state agencies to be required to implement the greenhouse gas goals and consider climate change in their practices. So what we're asking DNREC to do is to create roadmaps for each goal, to consult with vulnerable communities. These could be historically overburdened communities. These could be communities susceptible to sea level rise, often are one and the same. While they are creating the goals, not afterwards and say, hey, what do you think? We want them to consult with these communities while they're developing the plans, as well as to consult with state agencies to make sure each agency has what they need to be able to reach these goals. And we need a report every so often on how we're doing. We don't want to get to the goal year and say, oh, we're not going to do it. We're not going to make it. We want reports, interim reports. And that can look like a number of different things. Obviously, the pretty obvious solution would be to update the climate action plan every 5 years to make sure that we're doing everything we can to get to our 2030 and 2050 goal in particular. So for each state agency, we need them to review their planning and regulations and fiscal programming to look for what actions they can take immediately to help reduce emissions and combat climate change. And then submit reports every so often. We're kind of going back and forth on how often, at least no longer than every 4 years, but preferably every 2 years, to make sure that we are on the right track. And then looking at what are the fiscal impacts of climate change as well. By doing this, not only will we help make sure that we're heading in the right direction, so we're increasing accountability there, but we're also increasing transparency. We're making sure that the emission reductions that we're getting are being doled out equitably and not benefiting certain communities over others, and that we're making sure that the communities most in need of emission reductions and increased programming are getting that service. We also know that agencies, more so than DNREC, will know what they need. So DNREC's not going to know what DelDOT or the Department of Education needs, in so much as DelDOT and the Department of Education will. So they're going to know their unique challenges that they need to overcome to help get us to these goals. And so we really need them at the table. I think it was record time. So this is a little outdated. So I'm gonna share in the chat what action you can take. You can certainly send a letter, and that's what this QR code is for, to the governor and to legislators to let them know, like, hey, we want this to happen. But to update that, so we know there's a bill in progress. So letters are still great. Make sure that they know that we want, strong goals. But we really need that to happen now. We need the bill to be out now. We need folks to be able to get this passed and across the finish line this year. And so together with Interfaith Power and Light and a plethora of other organizations I'm not going to list out right now, we're hosting a rally on June 9th from 11 to 2 at Dover. And so we'll drop that link in the chat. But we really need folks that are able to come out at that time, because I know not everybody is. So if you are able to come out at that time, if you're going to do one thing, that's the thing. Show up to this rally. Because we really need, like, we can't have like 10 people outside of Dover, right? Like, it needs to be 100 plus if we're going to get these legislators to actually pass this year, because it's a huge lift. This sets the stage for all the climate actions that we want to do. If we don't have these goals, we don't have the planning, we don't have the reporting requirements, we're going to continue to, be very lackadaisical towards our climate change scenarios here in Delaware. So we have to set this into law to make sure that each agency and everybody in the state government is doing everything that they can, and to have that level of accountability. So show up June 9th, 11 to 2, outside of Legislative Hall in Dover. And I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dustin. I am going to bring all our panelists, and I'll put spotlight on everybody. But thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. If you follow the news, you know that we are in a climate emergency, and for Delaware, this is our moment that we need to seize. So if all of you, Justin, if you want to put that link in the chat for where people can send letters to their elected officials, to letting them know that they care, and show up for the rally, is what we need to do. And I'm trying to bring Dr. Ian and Steve, and we have them all. So there are some questions in the chat, and I'm going to start reading some of them. So Sharon Kimmel's question was, how you were showing that graph, Dr. Ian, and that was my question too. So with the climate warming, won't the food availability peak catch up with the bird nesting peak?
Well, in some species of plants and animals and insects, that is what's happening. There is like a plasticity. So some of the insects are starting to emerge earlier as well, because they're dependent on temperature cues, but not all insects are. Some insects emerge in relation to light levels, which don't really, which stay the same from year to year. And also in some cases, it's humidity that brings them out. And so it varies, I think, between different birds and different insects.
Thank you. Another question is from Karen, and I believe you answered that, but I just want to read it. Was that on the similar line? Why haven't the plants and insects also changed their life cycles, moving everything earlier as the birds have, right?
Yeah, and I think it's different hues, and some of the things that the birds eat, because I think, because some birds eat things like earthworms, but they are always going to be a bit behind the air temperature because they're dependent more on soil temperature, and it takes longer for the soil to warm up.
Got it. Then if there is so Karen's question was, how are Delaware Ornithological Society and Delaware Audubon Society different or similar? What does each organization do that sets them apart? Anybody wants to take that?
Delaware Ornithological Society is older than Delaware Audubon, and it's mainly involved with actual birding activities, bird walks, and they do great fundraising to purchase properties for protection for birds. Delaware Audubon is more involved with conservation issues. We don't lead bird walks. That's handled effectively by DOS. So we're mainly concerned with protecting habitat and on very specific issues. And our top issue right now is protection of the red knot. We're trying to get legislation to halt the harvest of horseshoe crabs, protect the red knot and other threatened shorebirds.
Thank you. I just want to put in the plug for the bird walk that we're doing with Dr. Ian on Thursday at 9 a.m. at Ashland Nature Center. If you would like to join the bird walk, I can put this is a Facebook link in the chat, but we'd like to know, or I can just put my email address. You can just let me know that you're coming. We'd just like to know who's coming, but the bird walk will be there. And we'd love to see you. And I know there was one more question from Austin. What can we do if a future Congress or a future president steers the nation away from a focus on climate?
I read that question and I had trouble coming up with an answer.
It's true. And,
The
and of course,
situation, hope we never get into, but it's a very realistic possibility.
it is indeed.
Well, I would say that let's do what we can now when we still have the time. So change policy like this one, right? We can do it now. So change whatever we can change now when we have the time. And the second is we vote carefully. We show up and we vote for the right candidates. And if we don't have favorable leadership, then we have to get together and do more of these rallies and show up and demand change. Dustin, you have anything to add there?
I don't know how many times I can beat the same drum before the drum turns into the dead horse, but my focus is always on state level politics, because we may be one of 50 states, but on the state level, you can exert an extraordinary amount of influence. So, and there's a lot that the states can do. I know Delaware is a small state, but we are a transportation corridor. So there's a lot we can do there. And yeah, so my advice to anybody that always gets disheartened at the federal level is, hey, your legislator lives down the road from you. And so they're a lot more local and more readily influenced. So
that's a great point, Dustin. Yeah.
Yes. And the other thing is there's going to be an economic penalty for not taking action on climate change. So if people want to be in denial about it, we're going to have to answer for the damages, economic damages that are going to occur.
Beth has a question. How do you respond to people who suggest that renewable energy sources, especially wind energy, are harmful to birds?
Well, I think the wind turbine people have got better at designing wind turbines and figuring out the right speed to get them to turn, that the birds mostly go around them. There are unfortunately cases where people have found dead birds underneath wind turbines, but they've tried to design them so they're more visible to like your bigger bird, because people were finding, occasionally dead, like a dead bald eagle or whatever, and it would make the news. So they've tried to make the fans more visible to any approaching bald eagles. And they try to sight, and when they sight them, they try to use sort of citizen science data or survey data to make sure that they're not in a place that's like funnels birds through.
They're also going to have triggers, so they'll shut off when there's a detection of a migration coming through.
and if it's the people that actually don't care what your answer is, I don't answer them.
And then now we know that, there's a very small percentage of birds that get really impacted, if at all, by those huge turbines. But then there are millions who are getting impacted, or billions, as you said, are impacted by climate change. So we have to see if we shift towards renewable energy, you can save those millions of birds. And that's why Delaware IPL supports offshore wind. And I see that Peggy Schulz, who is the facilitator of a common coalition, it's called Power, which is working specifically to bring offshore wind to Delaware. So join us. We meet a couple of times a month. And if you'd like to advocate for offshore wind, join us. I think this is all we had to cover for tonight. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, special thank you to all our panelists. Excellent presentations. I think for this topic, we really need to learn more. How are we getting impacted? Once we know how it impacts our health and it impacts people and the outdoors that we love so much, we are just more, more acceptable to take those actions. Also, a reminder that we'll be doing the bird walk at 9 o'clock this Thursday. Please show up at Ashland Nature Center. I will be sharing the link and some of the resources. Thank you again for joining us. Have a good night.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.